So this picture that I've been showing you of Indohyus becoming Pachycetus, becoming Ambulocetus, Myocetus, Rhodocetus, all that, blah, 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 leading to modern whales and dolphins, isn't quite what the evidence is suggesting. Actually, it's a little different than that. It's that these are all related through common ancestry. So a better way of actually representing this is this kind of a picture, which we call a cladogram. Each one of these groups is a clade, C-L-A-D-E, and if we start here, I want to start at the bottom. Now notice up at the top here we have time, and here at the bottom we have modern whales and dolphins, and that's why the arrow goes all the way to the end. And we look at the modern whales and dolphins in two groups. We classify them in two groups based on the following synapomorphic traits. There's baleen in some whales. They don't have teeth. They have these huge plates of kind of a hairy-like substance that's called baleen, and we call that group the Mysticetes, and they include the right whales and the blue whales and the humpback whales and things like this. There's another group which we call Odontocetes, literally mean toothed whales, whales with actual teeth, and that's a synapomorphic trait that defines them. Now, those two groups share a common ancestor. That's what this whole process is indicating to us. There's a common ancestor right here. This point right where the cursor is called a node. It's a connection point between this group and this group. This node represents a common ancestor, so that if you take a modern toothed whale, like a porpoise, a bottlenose dolphin, for example, and take a modern humpback whale, and follow their family lineages back from grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, great-great-great-grandparents, and so forth, all the way back. And the same thing with the bottlenose dolphin, you'd have a common family, a common species, and that's what would be represented here. And there's the synapomorphic trait defining that common species. Now, if we go back further in time, now that common ancestor is anticipated to be somewhere between 40 and 35 million years ago. Now, if you go back even further, we are getting evidence that Dorudon, which is one of the basilosaurs, actually has a common ancestor with the modern whales and dolphins that goes back to around 44 million years ago. And if we go further back, this group will connect with Rhodocetus that we saw before, and then the Rhodocetus and all these other groups connect back to Ambulocetus. Now, notice we're not saying that Ambulocetus became Rhodocetus became Dorudon. What we're saying is there's a common ancestor right here, which has these traits that it then gave to all of its descendants, and these descendants included Ambulocetus, Rhodocetus, Dorudon, and the modern whales and dolphins. And if we go back even further, there's a common ancestor that gave rise to Pachycetus and all of these other species. And back even further, a little more than 50 million years ago, there's evidence that we have something where we have Indohyus. It comes from a common ancestor with all these other creatures. And even further back, and I'll show you the evidence here shortly, we have evidence that in fact these creatures here are related to hippos. And that goes all the way back to about 56 or so million years ago. So that's how this works. We're looking at time going from left to right, and we see then modern species go all the way to the end. Many of them went extinct. That's what these things are when we find their fossils. This is how they're represented. And they have common ancestors. Now the point is, how many species are on this chart? Okay, in this particular cladogram, or also what we call the phylogeny. Well, there's what we call the terminal species. There's 1, 2, 3 that are currently extant, currently alive, plus another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that are extinct. Okay, so we have 3 plus 6. That gives us a total of 9 of the named organisms on the chart. But there's more than 9 organisms represented because each individual node, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 more nodes also represent some other species. We don't know what those species are necessarily. We don't necessarily have their fossils. Remember, fossilization is extremely rare. So we don't have, again, the vast majority of creatures that ever existed. So we probably don't even have this creature in our museums somewhere. But we do, however, have all of these. And that suggests how they actually fit together. So what we're looking at here are at least 17 different species that are represented on this chart. There's actually more than that because each one of these lineages represents a number of different species that have gone extinct in the past. So these groups, every single one of these groups is defined by synapomorphies, and they're marked here in this chart in red, and they're labeled. Okay, so that's the point. Now, if we look at this carefully, we can ask, okay, let's look at Indo-Hyas. Does this chart say that Indo-Hyas is more closely related to hippos or more closely related genetically to the baleen whales? Okay, well, if we follow this back, let's follow back. Where is the common ancestor between Indo-Hyas and the baleen whales? Well, I'm going to follow this all the way back, follow it back, and boom, bang, right there. There is the common ancestor with Indo-Hyas and the baleen whales right there. Okay, and so that's going to be somewhere about 51 million years ago. Where's the common ancestor between Indo-Hyas and hippos? Indo-Hyas goes back here, and then has to go all the way back here to find the common ancestor with the hippos. So Indo-Hyas genetically is expected to be more like baleen whales than it is like hippos. Even though on this chart, the way it's drawn, Indo-Hyas is close to hippos. What's important is where the depth of the node is. And when we say depth, we're looking at it going to the left. So how deep is that node? The depth of that node gives us what we would expect to be the genetic relationship between the two. So even though in this chart, Indo-Hyas is way far away from the Mysticetes, it actually is genetically more closely related to Mysticetes than it would be to the hippopotamus. So far in this lecture, I've been focusing primarily on the cetaceans, the whales and dolphins and their ancestors. But the thing that I want to emphasize is that this is not the only lineage that we see that has this kind of pattern where things appear to be related in this way. In fact, everything that we've looked at has this sort of a pattern. I'm going to show you some more examples very quickly, but the point is that these types of patterns that we see are ubiquitous, meaning they're everywhere. Every sort of creature that we look at. Here are just a few that you know reasonably well. For example, the mammals. Okay, if we look at the patterns of mammals, we go all the way back to 290 million years ago. Now look at the time pattern we're looking at here. For the whales and dolphins, we're talking about 55 million years ago. This is much, much farther back in time, 290 million years. So if we go back that far, we can find no fossil mammals. The earliest fossil mammals are about 220 million years old. But back 290 million years ago, there were these creatures that are generally classified as what are called pelycosaurs. And these pelycosaurs are what we call synapsids. And they're early synapsids. We as human beings are also synapsids. And the traits, the synapomorphic traits associated with these is the articulation of the jaws and the teeth and some other characteristics. Now, these creatures were reptiles. Reptiles include snakes and crocodiles and lizards and things like this, turtles. Those are all reptiles. And they're reptiles because they lay eggs that are what are called amniotic. They have a fluid, an amniotic fluid around the embryo so that the embryo can basically develop within that fluid. And these pelycosaurs had that same property. They laid eggs, and they had a jaw, though, that was attached all the way to the back of the skull, which is different than ours, different than the mammals. The mammals, the jaw is attached more forward. And they had, what's interesting enough, though, they had some other mammal-like characteristics. So this is not a dinosaur. In fact, it's quite different than a dinosaur. It's much more mammalian-like, but it is very clearly a reptile. Well, okay, if you want to argue, the biologists are arguing maybe they're not even reptiles because they really are quite different than the other reptiles that were around at that time. But later in time, they gave rise to creatures like this, Dimetrodon. And Dimetrodon, well, you probably have seen it before. It's got this big sail. This thing is, again, a very interesting creature. It's got a lot of reptilian characteristics, but it also has a number of characteristics of mammals, teeth patterns especially, and so forth. Then, if you go a little bit further forward in time, about 250 million years ago, you get cynodonts. And cynodonts, literally, they're called dog teeth. So these types of teeth are starting to look more like mammalian teeth with the big incisor, the big canines and so forth. And these creatures are generally referred to as therapsids. They're in a general group that we call therapsids. And they are so mammal-like and so reptile-like that we really don't know whether they had fur or scales. The later ones pretty clearly had fur. But the earlier ones, it's not clear. Did they have scales like a reptile or fur like a mammal? So again, we see the same sort of patterns here. And then at the very top, we finally get the later synapsids here, the later therapsids, which is again just before the mammals, and then we get the modern mammals. The modern mammals, again, like we know already, their synaptomorphic traits are fur and milk, and the way their jaw articulates with the skull is what I just mentioned. So that's one example. It's another example of these types of patterns that we see in the mammals. So we know where the mammals came from. But the mammals arose long before the cetaceans, which makes sense. The cetaceans are already mammals, so they had to have started long after this transition occurred. But there's more. What about this? What is this thing right here? You look at it. Here's a reconstruction of it, like this, and it has big feathers. And what's interesting about it is not like things you've seen on the planet today. It had feathers on its front limbs, but also on its hind limbs. It has these feathers that stick off on the hind limbs as well. You look at that and you're like, yeah, that's a bird. Yeah, it looks just like a bird. Yeah, except it's got this long bony tail that birds don't have, and it's got teeth that birds don't have. You know what this thing is? This is a dinosaur. This is an actual dinosaur. And it's of a type of dinosaur called Microraptor. We now have a number of species of this type of little dinosaur. Notice Microraptor. Little thief, that's what raptor means. You might remember what was going on in Jurassic Park and Jurassic World. There were the velociraptors, the fast thief. These are called raptors because they're in the same group as Velociraptor. They're anatomically very much like Velociraptor, but they're small, and they had feathers. That is a dinosaur, guys. So how do we know that? Well, we know it from the fossil record. First of all, we look at the characteristics of this. If you take away the obvious feathers, anybody looking at this, and in fact they did, when we first were finding fossils of similar species, not exactly this one, but similar ones without any feathers, they classified them as dinosaurs. They were obviously dinosaurs. They had dinosaur characteristics. But this one clearly had feathers. Not only that, but their chemical traces that indicate that the feathers were much like a grackle or a blackbird today. They were probably black and slightly iridescent. So if we look at the origins of the birds, here are the dinosaurs, and here are what we call the ornithischian dinosaurs. That includes a lot of your favorites like Triceratops or Pentaceratops, it's shown here, and so forth. And then we have these things, Coelophysis, Eoraptor, Allosaurus, and the Tyrannosaurids are in this group as well. But as we go up further in time, go closer to our time, again, about 150 or so million years ago, 160 million years ago, we start to see lots and lots of dinosaurs that had feathers, including Velociraptor. Velociraptor had feathers. So what's interesting is that the dinosaurs, many dinosaurs in this particular group had feathers. Not all of them. Most of them had scales, but we still have lots of examples of dinosaurs, very clear dinosaurs with feathers. And it gets to a point where it's blurred. You can't tell the difference between a dinosaur and a bird. It's very hard to tell. And that makes sense if the birds arose from the dinosaurs. And if they did, what's interesting about this, and we'll study this in 182 when you take your upper division evolution class, what you'll find is that the dinosaurs never went extinct. They're still in the bird lineages. The lineage of birds, the birds that we see today, really, since they came from dinosaurs, they really represent dinosaurs. So the dinosaurs never actually went extinct. And there's others. Look at the tetrapods. Now, these are the backboned animals, the vertebrates, that walk on all fours on land, except for us. We came from that lineage, but we walk on two legs. But they came from fish. Now, look at the ages here. Now, we're even older than we've seen before, 420, 410 million years ago, as opposed to up here, something like 200 million years ago, and way earlier than this, 55 million years ago. Now, what was the Earth like? What kind of creatures existed 420 million years ago? Well, we've never seen a fossil of that age of any vertebrate, creature with a backbone, besides fish. There are no amphibian fossils that old. There are no reptile fossils that old. There are no mammal fossils that old. There are no dinosaur fossils that old. The only vertebrate fossils that we find are fish. But we have a sequence of fossils that starts with this, Eusthenopteron, and goes through Tiktaalik and goes all the way up to Tuliparon. And those fossils represent a beautiful transition as to how this body pattern that we saw before with the humerus, the ulna and the radius, the carpals, the metacarpals, and the phalanges all arose. Now again, we're hundreds of millions of years before what we've seen before. But this is a beautiful sequence of transitional fossils that lead to the tetrapods. Okay? Now, this then is the pattern that we see, and these are just another few examples. But every time we find creatures, every time we find fossils, they fit into an evolutionary sequence like this. So that's why it is that we have so much overwhelming evidence for change through time, common descent, and evolution. What's interesting about this, though, is that's not even our strongest evidence. Our strongest evidence actually comes from the genes. If you look at the genes, I've already started talking about this. You look at your genes, you have in your genome, in your set of genes, a bunch of broken genes from other species, more than 10,000 of them. And you only have about 25,000 genes total. So there are half as many broken genes from other species inside of you as you have functional genes. And again, that makes sense if things are changing from one form to another. Why do you have a broken gene from a chimpanzee? Why do you have a broken gene from a mouse? Because you inherited that gene from a common ancestor that you have with the mouse. The mouse lineage, the gene continued to function, but in your lineage, it broke somewhere along the line. That makes sense. Otherwise, why would something dump a bunch of broken genes into your genome? Okay, so that's one of the things we're going to talk about here in just a moment. Okay, so let me show you what I'm getting at. If we have this kind of a sequence where this creature has hooves and this has hooves and Ambulocetus had hooves, but these guys don't, we would be saying it's because there was a common ancestor here that had hooves. And these are its descendants, the hippos, the modern hippos, which also have hooves. That's a hoofed mammal. And the reason they have hooves is because they inherited it just like the hippos did from the common ancestor. That's why they had it. Now, these guys lost it, and they no longer have hooves in the same way that they lost their hind limbs. They no longer have hind limbs. But those synapomorphic traits that they do share, like the involucrum and all that sort of stuff, would have arisen here, not here. Okay, so if that's true, though, then the modern whales and dolphins should be like other hoofed mammals, especially hippos. They should not be like non-hoofed mammals, like, for example, humans. And they should not look genetically like dogs or cats or bears. They should not look genetically like bats. They should not look genetically like squirrels and things like this. So what we need to do is to look at that. We need to predict what we see if that sequence is correct. Well, here's what one possibility would be. If we look at them genetically, then the modern whales and dolphins, which should be related to Indohyus, that's what this is, and this is another thing that's called Mesonychid, we're going to talk about that later. If that's true, then these two should be very closely related. Of course, we don't have the genetics of the Indohyus, but that means that the cetaceans, modern whales and dolphins, should be more genetically like the hoofed mammals than they are like any other type of mammal, mammals without hooves. Okay? If that's true, that's one possibility. In this case, we would say that the cetaceans are a sister group to the artiodactylans, the hoofed mammals with even toes. Okay, that's one possibility. It was suggested by one particular group called that was published in 2007. Now, there's another possibility, and that is that the dolphins actually could be within the hoofed mammals, so that the hippos and the dolphins are really closely related and more closely related to each other genetically than they are to the other hoofed mammals, like, for example, pronghorns and pigs and camels. So this would not be a sister group. The cetaceans wouldn't be a sister group to the hoofed mammals. They would actually be genetically hoofed mammals. When we say that, we don't mean that the whales and dolphins have hooves. We know they don't. But the point is, genetically, if you were just looking at them by genes and not looking at their body form, you would say, yeah, they're more closely related to hippos, or hippos are more closely related to the whales and dolphins than hippos are to any other hoofed mammal, which means the whales and dolphins would really be hoofed mammals. That's another possibility. So how do we compare genes? What do you do to compare genes? Well, what you can do is this. Find the genes and lay them out in what's called a sequence alignment. You align the DNA like is done here for this particular gene called GNAT3. Now in this case then, if you notice here, A, a bunch of A's, and then G and blah, 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 all these different letters A, C, G, and T, you know what those are. Those are all bases that are in the DNA. Now, this is marked in such a way that when all of them agree in all these different species, the species in this analysis include humans, mice, cows, hippos. There were 3 different specimens from minke whales, a sei whale, bottlenose porpoise, and a bottlenose dolphin, I should say. When there's an asterisk here, that means all the species in the analysis completely agree. They're all A, they're all A again, this one is all A, blah, 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 here's one that's all G, and so forth. When they differ, there's no asterisk. I mean, somewhere in here you'll find a difference, and you'll notice right there, there's an A in the mouse, and everybody else has a G. Okay? Now, when it's black, what they're doing is specifically looking at things that are specific to the cetaceans or to a particular group. For example, here, notice there's a dash there. That means all the whales and dolphins that they looked at are missing that DNA in that particular base position. Okay? And then here is where they're all the same among the whales and dolphins, but different among other species. And here's another one where there was a deletion in two of the minke whales that they had looked at, so forth. That's how we compare. We compare in very sophisticated ways. We can look very carefully at how those mutations must have arisen in order to connect them together. But even more simply, we can just simply count up the number of ways in which their sequences align and then take a proportion of that and determine how similar they are genetically. So that's been done. And in this analysis, they were testing this hypothesis and even testing to see whether or not the hoofed mammals are related to the cetaceans. So they looked at a huge number of different species, not just dolphins and whales and hoofed mammals, but a bunch of other species, and here's the result that they got. Now, this particular study is looking not just at the DNA, but taking DNA from existing animals, comparing it to the morphology of them and fossil animals where we don't have DNA. So it's a combination of genetics and looking at the animal's physical characteristics. And what they find is this: depending on exactly what characteristics you use, you always, no matter what, always get the whales and dolphins inside the hoofed mammals. Okay, so here's dogs, cats, and so forth like this. These are the carnivores and so on. And here a bunch of other hoofed mammals. These are the odd-toed hoofed mammals, the Parasidactylus. And here are what are usually or have traditionally been called the artiodactyls. And then here are the cetaceans. But notice, here is that cladogram, that phylogeny. Now here, this blue, all of these blue are whales and dolphins and the fossil whales and dolphins, which includes Ambulocetus here and Indohyus here. And notice, they share a common ancestor right here with the hippos. The hippos are next, just like we saw before. And then, after that, we have nodes out here that put them in with other types of fossil creatures. But then, after that, we have a node that puts them in with the other hoofed mammals. So what this analysis is saying is, look, the hippo is more genetically related to the modern whales and dolphins than it is to the other hoofed mammals, which is exactly what was predicted by this hypothesis, meaning the cetaceans are actually within the group of hoofed mammals. They're not a sister group, they're not next to it, but they're within it, which means genetically, this analysis is saying, genetically, whales and dolphins are hoofed mammals. Meaning this, if you had a creature that came from a different planet, and all that creature had was genetics, and they could classify the species just looking at the DNA sequences like this, and that's all they had. They couldn't see the animals. They would classify the whales and dolphins and the hoofed mammals together in one group. Therefore, we should. And not only that, but the physical evidence does definitely corroborate that these guys are more like the whales and dolphins and like hippos as well than they are to other types of creatures, including things that are other carnivores, right? So this is kind of interesting. Now, there's this one group, Mesonychid, this group here, which is still unknown. It's a really interesting thing. This is a very clear carnivore, but it was hoofed mammal. And the analysis tends to put this guy all over the place, depending on exactly what characters are chosen. So we don't really know what's going on with the Mesonychids. It's possible that these are also very closely related to the whales and dolphins, but it may not be. And then the analyses are tending to be kind of unclear on exactly that. But the point is that this analysis and others that are like it, this is one of the most complete ones, which is why I'm using it. This analysis always agrees with the other analyses that whales and dolphins are right close to or within the hoofed mammal group. So the fossil record is tending to agree with the genetic record and the genetic evidence. So this is really quite a fascinating thing. It appears to be this is the situation. So why is it that these things changed? And how is it? Now, we're not saying a cow became a dolphin, but we're saying that the genes of this cow are more like a dolphin's than they are like other tetrapods, like dogs and cats and wolves and things like this. And so how does that happen? How do we get things that change? How do we get something that's a common ancestor that gives rise to all of these different things? That's what we're going to talk about in the next lecture.